Michael Carter stood in the driveway of what used to be his home, loading the last box into his truck, while his wife Jennifer watched from the doorway with a smile that could only be described as triumphant. It was a cold November morning, and the finality of what was happening hung in the air like frost. Jennifer's arms were crossed, her posture radiating satisfaction as she watched her husband of 12 years pack up his belongings and prepare to leave the house they'd shared for over a decade. "You're really going to regret this, Michael," Jennifer called out, her voice carrying that particular mix of condescension and fake concern she'd perfected over the years. "Walking away from everything we built together. You'll see how hard it is out there on your own. Don't come crawling back when you realize what you gave up." Michael said nothing, just secured the last box and closed the truck bed. He'd learned over the past 6 months that arguing with Jennifer was pointless. She'd made up her mind about how this divorce would go, and in her version of events, she was the victim and he was the fool making the biggest mistake of his life by leaving her. What Jennifer didn't know, what she'd never bothered to verify because she'd been so confident in her assumptions, was that Michael's name was still on everything: the house, the cars, the investment accounts, the rental properties, all of it. And over the next few months, Jennifer Bennett Carter was going to learn a very expensive lesson about the difference between assumption and reality. The problems in Michael and Jennifer's marriage hadn't started overnight. They'd been building for years, a slow accumulation of resentment, contempt, and fundamental incompatibility that both of them had ignored, until ignoring it became impossible. Michael was a software engineer who'd started his career at a major tech company before going independent as a consultant. Jennifer worked in real estate, selling high-end properties in their affluent suburban area outside Seattle. On paper, they were the perfect power couple. Both successful, both ambitious, both earning good money and living a lifestyle that made their friends envious. But beneath the surface, their marriage had been rotting from the inside out, and the decay had started with Jennifer's affair. Michael had discovered it 18 months ago, purely by accident. Jennifer had left her iPad on the kitchen counter, and a message had popped up from someone named Bradley. The message itself was innocent enough, but something about the familiar tone made Michael look closer. What he found was 6 months of correspondence between his wife and a divorced real estate broker she worked with. Messages that made it crystal clear they'd been sleeping together for most of that time. The confrontation had been ugly. Jennifer had cycled through denial, then minimization, then blame shifting. It was Michael's fault, she'd argued, because he worked too much and didn't pay enough attention to her. She'd felt neglected, unappreciated, and Bradley had made her feel special again. Michael was too focused on his career, too boring, too unwilling to take risks or live the kind of exciting life Jennifer wanted. Michael had been devastated, but he'd tried to save the marriage. They'd gone to counseling for 8 months, and during that time Jennifer had promised to end the affair, to work on their relationship, to recommit to their marriage. Michael had believed her because he'd wanted to believe her, because 12 years of history seemed worth fighting for. But the affair hadn't ended. Michael discovered, through a mutual friend, that Jennifer and Bradley were still seeing each other, just being more careful about it. When Michael confronted her again, Jennifer's response had been chilling in its honesty. "I don't know if I love you anymore, Michael. Maybe this marriage was a mistake. Maybe we're just too different." That's when Michael had stopped trying to save the marriage and started planning his exit. But he'd done it carefully, methodically, with the same analytical approach he brought to his work. He'd consulted with the best divorce attorney in Seattle, a sharp woman named Rebecca Thornton, who specialized in high-acid divorces. And what Rebecca had told him had been both surprising and strategic. "Michael, you need to understand something," Rebecca had said during their first consultation. "In Washington state, we have community property laws, which means everything acquired during the marriage is generally split 50-50. But there are exceptions, and there are strategies. Before you do anything, before you file, before you move out, before you tell Jennifer you want a divorce, we need to document everything and make sure we understand exactly what assets we're dealing with. Over the next 3 months, Michael had done exactly that. He documented every asset, every account, every property. He'd discovered things even he hadn't fully realized about their financial situation. And what he'd found had been illuminating. The house they lived in, a beautiful 4-bedroom colonial in an upscale neighborhood, was titled in Michael's name only. He'd bought it 2 years before meeting Jennifer, using money from an inheritance after his father died. They'd renovated it together during their marriage, but the original property and most of the equity was Michael's separate property under Washington law. The 2 rental properties they owned were also titled in Michael's name only. He'd purchased them with money he'd earned from his consulting business before marriage, and while they'd generated income during the marriage, the properties themselves were his separate assets. The investment accounts were more complicated. They had joint accounts worth about $400,000, which would be split in the divorce. But Michael also had retirement accounts worth nearly $1 million that he'd largely funded before marriage, plus stock options from his previous tech company employment that had vested before he'd met Jennifer. Then there were the cars. Jennifer drove a Mercedes SUV that was leased in Michael's name. Michael drove a Tesla that he owned outright, purchased before the marriage. Jennifer's car payment was $600 a month, paid automatically from their joint account. Michael had established an LLC for his consulting business before meeting Jennifer, and all his business income flowed through that entity, while income earned during marriage was community property. The business itself was his separate asset, and Rebecca had helped him structure things to protect it during the divorce. What all of this meant, Rebecca explained, was that Jennifer's assumption that she'd get half of everything in the divorce was wrong. She'd get half of community property accumulated during the marriage, but Michael's separate property, the house, the rentals, the premarital retirement accounts, the business, would remain his. She's going to be shocked, Rebecca said with a slight smile. Most people assume that divorce means everything gets split down the middle. But Washington law is more nuanced than that, and in your case, you brought substantially more assets into the marriage than she did. She'll get a fair settlement, but it won't be anywhere near what she's probably expecting. She thinks she's getting the house, Michael said. She's already told friends. She's planning to keep it. And I'll have to find an apartment. Well, she's in for a rude awakening. The house is your separate property. She has no legal claim to it. She's going to have to move out. Not you. But Michael had decided to move out anyway, at least temporarily. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to. Living with Jennifer for the past 6 months while planning the divorce had been toxic. Her affair was continuing, barely concealed now that she knew Michael knew about it. She'd become openly contemptuous, mocking his career, his personality, his supposed inability to satisfy her needs. And she'd become confident, overconfident, about how the divorce would go. She'd told friends that she was going to take Michael to the cleaners, that she'd get the house, half his business, half his retirement accounts, and substantial alimony because she'd sacrificed her career growth to support his consulting business. None of that was true. But Jennifer had convinced herself it was. She'd consulted with a divorce attorney herself, but she'd clearly either lied to him about what assets were separate property, or he'd given her bad advice. Either way, Jennifer had constructed a fantasy version of how the divorce would proceed, and she'd been broadcasting that fantasy to everyone who would listen. So when Michael finally filed for divorce and moved out, Jennifer had been thrilled. She'd seen it as Michael giving up, walking away, leaving her in possession of everything they'd built. She'd told him he'd regret leaving, that he was making a mistake, that he'd realized too late what he was giving up. What she didn't realize was that Michael wasn't giving up anything. He was executing a carefully planned exit from a toxic marriage, and he'd done it in a way that protected his interests while complying fully with the law. The first indication Jennifer got that things weren't going as she'd planned came 2 weeks after Michael moved out. She received the divorce petition, delivered by a process server who showed up at the house on a Tuesday morning. Jennifer had been expecting it, but when she read through the documents, her confidence started to crack. Michael was claiming the house as separate property. He was claiming the rental properties as separate property. He was claiming his business as separate property. He was offering to split the joint accounts 50-50 and to pay her a portion of the community property portion of his retirement accounts. But he was making it clear that the bulk of his assets were not community property and would not be divided. Jennifer immediately called her attorney, a man named Dennis Walsh, who worked at a small family law practice in Bellevue. Dennis had told her during their initial consultation that she'd likely get half of everything, but that consultation had been based on Jennifer's description of their assets, which had been incomplete and misleading. "He can't do this," Jennifer told Dennis, her voice rising. "The house is ours. We've lived in it for 12 years. I've put work into it. I've made it our home. He can't just claim it's his alone." Dennis reviewed the documents Michael had provided. "When did he purchase the house?" "I don't know. Before we got married. But, and how was it titled when you got married?" "Just in his name. But I assumed we'd refinance or add me to the title after we were married. Did you ever do that?" "No, but..." "Jennifer, if the house was purchased before marriage with separate funds and was never retitled as community property, it's his separate property, under Washington law. You'd need to prove that you contributed to the mortgage or improvements in a way that increased the equity. And even then, you'd only be entitled to reimbursement for your contributions, not half the house. I lived there. I decorated it. I maintained it. That's not the same as contributing to the equity." "Did you pay any of the mortgage payments?" Jennifer fell silent. The truth was, Michael had paid the mortgage out of his business account every month for their entire marriage. The automatic payment had been set up years before they'd met, and it had never changed. Jennifer's income had gone toward her car, her personal expenses, and into the joint account they used for groceries and entertainment. She'd never paid $1 toward the mortgage. "What about the rental properties?" Jennifer asked desperately. "When were they purchased, and how are they titled?" "I don't know exactly when, but they're in his name. If they were purchased with his separate funds before marriage and never retitled, they're his separate property too." "This isn't fair. We were married for 12 years. I'm entitled to half of everything we built together. You are entitled to half of community property accumulated during marriage. But property he brought into the marriage or purchased with separate funds remains his separate property, unless it was somehow commingled or gifted to the community. From what you're telling me, that didn't happen." Jennifer's fantasy about taking Michael to the cleaners was crumbling in real time. She called Michael that night, her voice oscillating between anger and false sweetness, as she tried to manipulate him into changing his position. "Michael, this petition is ridiculous. You can't seriously claim that everything is yours alone. We were married for 12 years. We built a life together." "We did. And you destroyed it by having an affair with Bradley for 18 months. But yes, I'm claiming my separate property as separate property, which is exactly what Washington law allows me to do. The house is our home. The house is my property. I bought it with my inheritance before I met you. You never contributed to the mortgage, never paid for improvements, never added your name to the title. It's mine, Jennifer. It always was. So I'm just supposed to leave? Where am I supposed to go? That's not my problem. You were so confident you'd be keeping the house, and I'd be the one scrambling for an apartment. Turns out the situation is reversed. You should have verified your assumptions before being so smug about me leaving. You did this on purpose. You tricked me. I didn't trick you. I documented reality. You made assumptions based on what you wanted to be true. rather than what was actually true. That's not my fault. Jennifer tried pleading. Please, Michael, can't we work something out? Can't we split things fairly? You'll get half of the joint accounts, half of the community portion of my retirement accounts, and I'll give you your personal belongings and the furniture you brought into the marriage. That's fair under the law. What about alimony? You make $70,000 a year selling real estate. I'll agree to pay limited alimony for 3 years to help you transition, but nothing beyond that. You're perfectly capable of supporting yourself. 3 years. I sacrificed my career for you. You did no such thing. Your income has remained steady throughout our marriage. You haven't sacrificed anything except your marriage vows. Jennifer hung up on him, fury radiating through the phone line. But over the next few weeks, as her attorney continued to review the documentation Michael provided, the reality of her situation became unavoidable. Michael had separated his finances carefully and legally. He hadn't hidden anything or committed fraud. He'd simply maintained proper documentation of what was his separate property and what was community property. The house would be his. The rental properties would be his. His business would be his. Jennifer would get about $200,000 from the joint accounts and maybe another $100,000 from the community portion of his retirement accounts. She'd get 3 years of alimony at $1,500 per month, and she'd get to keep her personal belongings and some of the furniture. It was a far cry from the millionaire divorce settlement she'd been boasting about to her friends. The situation got worse for Jennifer when Michael formally requested that she vacate the house. She'd assumed she could stay there at least until the divorce was finalized, but Michael's attorney filed a motion pointing out that the house was Michael's separate property. Jennifer had no legal right to remain there, and her continued occupancy was preventing Michael from returning to his own home. The judge agreed. Jennifer was given 60 days to vacate the premises. She would need to find her own place to live, pay her own rent, and manage her own expenses without the buffer of Michael's income supporting their lifestyle. This is insane, Jennifer raged to her friends over wine one evening. He's kicking me out of my own home because of some legal technicality. The house should be ours. We lived there together for 12 years. Her friend Melissa, a paralegal who'd been watching the situation unfold with growing concern, spoke up gently. Jennifer, it's not a technicality. If Michael owned the house before you got married, and you never contributed to it or changed the title, it legally is his house. You might not like it, but it's the law. Whose side are you on? I'm not on anyone's side. I'm just trying to help you understand reality. You've been saying for months that you were going to get half of everything, but you never actually verified that was true. Now you're finding out it's not, and you're angry at Michael instead of being angry at yourself for making assumptions. So I'm supposed to just accept that I get almost nothing after 12 years of marriage? You're getting what the law entitles you to, based on the actual facts of your situation. If you wanted more protection, you should have insisted on retitling assets during the marriage. You should have contributed to the mortgage. You should have built your own financial security instead of assuming Michael's assets were automatically yours. You're being cruel. I'm being honest. And honestly, Jennifer, you've been telling everyone for months that Michael would regret leaving, that he'd realize he made a mistake, that he was walking away from everything. But he wasn't walking away from anything. His name is still on everything. You're the one who has to leave. The conversation ended in tension, but Melissa's words haunted Jennifer because they were true. She had made assumptions. She had believed what she wanted to believe rather than verifying the facts. And now she was facing the consequences of that willful ignorance. Finding a new place to live was humiliating. Jennifer had been telling everyone she was keeping the house, and now she had to explain to friends, family, and colleagues that actually she was moving to a small 2-bedroom apartment in Redmond because that was what she could afford on her salary, without Michael's income supplementing it. The Mercedes had to go too. Jennifer couldn't afford the $600 monthly lease payment on her own, and when she tried to negotiate with Michael to keep paying it, he'd refused. "You can turn in the lease and get something you can actually afford," Michael said, "or you can pay for it yourself out of your settlement, but I'm not continuing to fund your lifestyle." Jennifer ended up trading the Mercedes for a 3-year-old Honda Accord, a perfectly nice car but a far cry from the luxury vehicle she'd grown accustomed to. Every time she climbed into it, she felt the sting of what she'd lost. But the hardest part wasn't the material losses. It was the social embarrassment. Jennifer had spent months telling people she was going to take Michael to the cleaners. She'd positioned herself as the wronged wife who was finally going to get what she deserved from her boring workaholic husband. She'd practically celebrated when he moved out, treating it as her victory. Now, as the truth emerged, as people learned that Jennifer was the one moving to a small apartment, driving a modest car, and getting a relatively small settlement, the narrative shifted. Friends who'd supported her began to quietly distance themselves. Colleagues whispered about how she'd miscalculated badly. Some people even started to question the affair, wondering if maybe Jennifer had been the problem in the marriage, rather than Michael. The absolute lowest point came when Jennifer had to move out of the house. Michael had been generous enough to stay away during the move, not wanting to cause additional conflict. But as Jennifer packed up her belongings and watched the movers load them into a truck, the finality of what had happened hit her with crushing force. She'd had everything: a beautiful home, financial security, a husband who'd been faithful and supportive even when she'd betrayed him. And she'd thrown it all away for an affair with Bradley, who turned out to be far less interested in a serious relationship once Jennifer was actually divorced and available. "I thought we had something real," Jennifer had told Bradley after the divorce papers were served. "We had fun," Bradley had replied with a shrug. "But I'm not really looking for something serious right now. You knew I was just getting out of my own divorce, Jennifer. I was pretty clear about not wanting to jump into another marriage." So Jennifer had blown up her marriage for an affair partner who'd never intended to be more than temporary. And she'd been so confident that the divorce would leave her financially secure that she'd never bothered to verify whether that confidence was justified. The divorce was finalized 6 months after Michael filed. Jennifer received her settlement, about $350,000 total when everything was calculated, and walked away from a marriage where she'd expected to walk away with millions. Michael moved back into the house, the one Jennifer had been so sure she'd keep. He repainted the bedroom, bought new furniture, and slowly erased the traces of a marriage that had ended in betrayal and bitterness. He threw himself into his consulting work, taking on new clients and expanding his business. About 8 months after the divorce was finalized, Michael ran into Jennifer at a mutual friend's birthday party. It was awkward, inevitable in their overlapping social circles. Jennifer looked tired, older, with a brittleness around her eyes that hadn't been there before. "You got what you wanted," Jennifer said, unable to help herself. "You kept everything." "I kept what was mine," Michael corrected. "And I gave you what the law required me to give you. If you wanted more, you should have contributed more or protected yourself better." "That's cold." "What's cold is having an affair for 18 months, lying about ending it, and then mocking me for leaving while planning to take everything I'd built before we even met." "You told me I'd regret leaving the house, Jennifer. But my name was still on everything. You regret it?" "Not me." Jennifer's eyes filled with tears. "I made mistakes. I know that. But did you have to be so ruthless about the divorce? I was fair. You got exactly what you were entitled to under the law. The problem is that what you were entitled to was a lot less than what you assumed you'd get. You made assumptions without verification, Jennifer. You do that a lot." "What's that supposed to mean? You assumed I was boring and uncaring, so you justified your affair. You assumed you'd get half of everything in the divorce, so you told everyone you'd take me to the cleaners. You assumed Bradley wanted a serious relationship, so you left your marriage for him. You assume things that fit the narrative you want, instead of checking whether they're actually true. And then you're shocked and angry when reality doesn't match your assumptions. Jennifer wiped her eyes. You really think I'm that shallow? Shallow implies you knew the truth and didn't care. Unobservant means you never bothered to find out what was true in the first place. You were married to me for 12 years and you never knew whose name was on the house title. That's not shallow, Jennifer. That's just not paying attention. Michael walked away, and that was the last substantive conversation they ever had. Over the years, he'd occasionally hear about Jennifer through mutual friends. She'd eventually started dating again, had some relationships that didn't work out, and eventually married a divorced father of 2, who worked in pharmaceutical sales. It seemed like a decent life, if not the glamorous one she'd once envisioned. Michael dated casually for a couple years after the divorce. Not rushing into anything serious, he'd learned important lessons from his marriage to Jennifer, about the importance of compatibility, about recognizing red flags early, about the difference between someone loving you and someone loving what you provide. 3 years after the divorce, Michael met someone at a tech conference in San Francisco. Her name was Amanda Park. She was a project manager at a cybersecurity firm, and they bonded over terrible conference coffee and shared frustration with a particularly boring keynote speaker. Their first real conversation was about work-life balance and the challenges of maintaining relationships in demanding careers. Amanda had been married once before, divorced young, and had spent the last decade building her career and being very selective about relationships. I learned the hard way that compatibility matters more than chemistry, Amanda told Michael over dinner after the conference ended. My ex-husband and I had tons of chemistry, but we wanted completely different lives. It took me years to realize that love isn't enough if you're not actually compatible. I learned something similar, Michael said. My ex-wife and I looked compatible on paper, both successful, both ambitious, but our values were completely different. She cared about status and appearances. I cared about substance and authenticity. That gap became impossible to bridge. They dated long distance for 6 months, taking turns flying between Seattle and San Francisco on weekends. The relationship developed slowly, carefully, both of them bringing wisdom from past mistakes. They talked about finances openly, about assets and debts, and how they'd approach money in a serious relationship. Amanda knew about Michael's house and rental properties and business within the first few months, not because he was showing off, but because they were having honest conversations about their lives. I appreciate that you're transparent about this stuff, Amanda said during one of those conversations. My ex was really secretive about money and it caused problems. I'd rather know what I'm getting into. My ex made a lot of assumptions about money without ever asking questions, Michael replied. Then she was furious during the divorce, when reality didn't match her assumptions. I promised myself I'd never be in another relationship where we weren't both completely clear about the practical stuff. They got engaged after 18 months of dating and married in a small ceremony at Michael's house, the one Jennifer had been so sure she'd keep, the one she'd told him he'd regret leaving. The irony wasn't lost on Michael, but he felt no particular triumph about it. Jennifer was part of his past, a chapter that taught him important lessons, but didn't define his future. Amanda moved to Seattle, and they built a partnership that was everything Michael's first marriage hadn't been. Honest, equitable, built on mutual respect rather than assumptions and status concerns. They combined their finances thoughtfully, creating a prenuptial agreement that protected both of their interests while committing to building a shared life. This is what partnership looks like. Marcus Chen, Michael's longtime friend and the best man at both his weddings, said during his toast at the reception, Michael's first marriage taught him that assumptions without verification lead to resentment and conflict. Amanda's first marriage taught her that chemistry without compatibility leads nowhere good. Together, they've built something based on actually knowing each other, on honest communication, on shared values instead of shared assumptions. That's what makes a marriage last. 5 years after marrying Amanda, Michael sold 2 of his rental properties and used the proceeds to start a venture capital fund focused on software startups. Amanda left her corporate job to become COO of one of their portfolio companies. They had a daughter, bought a vacation property in the San Juans, and built a life that was successful not just financially, but emotionally and spiritually. Michael occasionally thought about Jennifer's words that morning when he'd moved out. "You're really going to regret this, Michael. Don't come crawling back when you realize what you gave up." He'd given up nothing but toxicity and disrespect. Everything that mattered, the house, the assets, his self-respect, had stayed with him because his name was still on everything, both literally and figuratively. Jennifer had made assumptions about who owned what, about who had power in their divorce, about who would regret their choices, and every single assumption had been wrong. The lessons from Michael's story are clear and powerful. First, assumptions without verification will destroy you. Jennifer spent 12 years married to Michael without ever verifying basic facts about asset ownership, then was shocked when divorce revealed her assumptions were wrong. If something matters to you, verify it. Don't assume. Second, confidence without knowledge is dangerous. Jennifer was supremely confident about how the divorce would go because she wanted it to go that way, not because she'd actually researched the law or documented the facts. Confidence based on wishes rather than reality leads to devastating surprises. Third, legal ownership matters more than emotional attachment. Jennifer felt like the house was hers because she'd lived there for 12 years. But feelings don't override legal title. Understanding who actually owns what in a marriage isn't unromantic. It's practical protection for both parties. We learn that mockery and contempt reveal character. Jennifer mocked Michael for leaving, told him he'd regret it, positioned herself as the winner. That contempt revealed her character and made the divorce less sympathetic when the truth emerged. The story teaches us that affairs have costs beyond emotional pain. Jennifer's affair didn't just destroy trust. It put her in a weaker position during divorce proceedings and cost her sympathy from friends and the legal system. Betrayal has practical consequences, not just emotional ones. We see the importance of building your own financial security. Jennifer had relied on Michael's assets to provide her lifestyle without building equivalent security of her own. When the marriage ended, she faced a harsh adjustment because she'd never protected herself financially. Most importantly, the story shows us that reality always emerges eventually. Jennifer built a fantasy about how the divorce would go and broadcast that fantasy to everyone who'd listen. But reality doesn't care about your fantasies. The truth about asset ownership, about legal rights, about who actually holds power, that truth emerged and made Jennifer's assumptions look ridiculous. The call to action from Michael's story is clear. Verify your assumptions about everything important. Don't assume you know who owns what, who has legal rights to what, how laws work. Verify. Ask questions. Get documentation. Your assumptions might be completely wrong. Build your own financial security regardless of relationship status. Don't rely on assuming you'll get half of everything if relationships end. Build assets in your own name, maintain your own accounts, create your own security. Treat your spouse with respect instead of contempt. Jennifer's mockery of Michael during their separation revealed her character and cost her sympathy. Respect costs nothing and protects relationships even when they're ending. Understand that legal rights matter more than feelings. You might feel entitled to something, but if your name isn't on the title and you didn't contribute to it, your feelings don't create legal rights. Protect yourself legally, not just emotionally. Be honest about finances with your partner. Michael's transparency with Amanda created trust and protection for both of them. Financial secrets and assumptions create conflict and unfair outcomes. Finally, recognize that bragging about outcomes before they happen often backfires spectacularly. Jennifer told everyone she'd take Michael to the cleaners, that he'd regret leaving. Her public confidence made the actual outcome even more humiliating when reality didn't match her fantasy. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about your own assumptions and whether you really know the legal and financial realities of your situation, share it with someone who needs this message. Subscribe to hear more stories about assumptions revealed, reality emerging, and the difference between what we think we know and what's actually true. May you verify instead of assume. May you build your own security instead of relying on assumptions about shared assets. May you treat people with respect, even in conflict. And may you never mock someone for leaving until you've verified who actually owns everything they're supposedly leaving behind. Remember, when you confidently tell someone they'll regret leaving, make sure you actually know whose name is on everything. Because mockery based on wrong assumptions makes you look foolish, not them. Reality doesn't care about your confidence. It just emerges indifferent and undeniable, revealing who actually holds the cards.